Well, sometime later, when I was working with the lawyers, that sort of faded into my distant memory. I was called by Richard Barr, one of the lawyers, and asked if I would attend a meeting on Newcastle Station with a doctor calling himself, a man calling himself George. We knew nothing more about it than that. They'd had a previous meeting with George on Newcastle Station. And the bottom line is, on a Sunday, we got on a train, went up to Newcastle Station, and there we met with George, and George would be wearing a red carnation. And indeed, George was wearing a red carnation, and we met with George, and George turned out to be the name of his son, who was an actor, and George turned out to be Dr. Alistair Torres, who was from the Scottish Department of Health. And Dr. Torres had been seconded onto the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, effectively from Canada. And he had been brought in, at least in part, to advise on the introduction of MMR vaccine. Now, the experience in Canada was that they introduced a vaccine which contained a mumps component made up of a strain of the vaccine called Urabi. It was originally generated in Japan. And they had run into problems with this vaccine. It produced meningitis in children. The mumps virus was identified in the spinal fluid around the brain of the children, and the vaccine was pulled in Canada. It was pulled, it was stopped in 1997. Nonetheless, this was the vaccine that was intended to be introduced in the UK a year later, 1988. Did I say 1997, 1987? It was the vaccine that was to be introduced in the UK in 1988. They changed the name. The vaccine was identical. So it had gone from Trivirix to Pluzarix in the UK, an identical vaccine that had already been withdrawn for safety reasons in Canada. Now, Torres advised the JCVI not to introduce this vaccine because it was not safe. He was overruled. He had said that, well, if you are going to introduce it, then you should have active surveillance. That is, doctors or people going out there and asking doctors, have you seen any cases of the following in the last month? Not waiting for doctors to spontaneously report, because spontaneous reports pick up 1 to 2% of the true adverse reactions. And that is, these are data from the Food and Drug Administration in America. It's inadequate, totally inadequate, and they were overruled. No active surveillance. So they're going to introduce a vaccine that has been withdrawn in other countries, known to be unsafe, and they're going to have no active surveillance for possible adverse events to that vaccine in this country. Now, this was done, he said, for competitive pricing reasons. The strain of the vaccine that contained the dangerous mumps component was 1/4, approximately, the price of the American vaccine MMR2 made by Merck. There had been no reports of meningitis using the Merck vaccine, which contained a strain of mumps called Geraldine, derived from the daughter of the guy who actually isolated it in the first place, Maurice Hilleman. So what we had was a cheaper vaccine that was known to be dangerous. So when the vaccines were licensed, or when there was the proposal to license this vaccine in the country, the Joint Committee, or members of that committee, went to SmithKline Beecham and said, we want your vaccine. SmithKline said, well, we're not happy about this because this has already been withdrawn in Canada. It's got this mumps component in, which is dodgy. They said, if we're going to do it, then we want an indemnity. We want indemnity from prosecution for damage to children on the basis of the receipt of this vaccine. And it appears that that indemnity was granted. And Torres told us about this. And he said that at the meeting, the girl there from SmithKline Beecham said, we are immunising the children and the government are immunising us. So they entered into this relationship. The vaccine was produced, the vaccine was licensed, the vaccine was given, and cases of meningitis started to appear. They were recorded and documented in the minutes of the JCVI, which are now available online and have been obtained by us as part of this litigation. More and more of these cases started to be reported. The Scottish Department withdrew this vaccine, didn't want to give it. Certain health areas rejected the Urabi-containing vaccine, but still the JCVI continued with it. There was no withdrawing of this vaccine until finally a study was grudgingly done in Nottingham where they found that there was a much higher risk of this meningitis with this vaccine than had previously been predicted by passive surveillance, and the vaccine was withdrawn overnight. And it was only withdrawn overnight because it was leaked to the press. It appeared in a newspaper and suddenly the vaccine was pulled. So a dangerous vaccine, a knowingly dangerous vaccine, was introduced and ultimately proven to be dangerous and had to be withdrawn in 1992.